This is Cable 4, community and educational television for Baltimore County.
Welcome to Agenda 84. I am Paul Cunningham. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. I'll be sitting in for Jim Oates, who is unable to be with us today. Our topic for today is primaries and their impact, not only in the state of Maryland, but also throughout the nation. Our guests today include Dr. James McKenna, who is a professor of counseling. Dr. McKenna is currently completing an internship with the American Association of Community and Junior Colleges. He is the associate director of the Keep America Working Project and is a member of the State Central Committee of the Democratic Party. Also on our panel today is Don Jansiewicz. Professor Jansiewicz is a professor of political science, and John Ashby, who is a professor of history. Gentlemen, one of the things that I think we should probably begin with is answering the question of what a primary really is. Why do we have them? How did they get started? John, could you give us some idea?
Well, probably the most obvious thing to say is that a primary election is one in which the voters are choosing not office holders, but candidates who will represent their political party in the general election, which will take place at some subsequent date. As far as how they got started and why we have them, it was back around the turn of the 20th century that the progressive reformers in this country, thinking that American democracy was being corrupted by political bosses and political machines, set out to try to democratize American politics by involving the grassroots voters in the process of selecting candidates to represent their party. So beginning in the first decade or so of the 20th century, various states began to adopt the primary method of choosing candidates for public office and also choosing delegates to national political conventions at the same time. So the primary election as a way of doing our political business is approximately 70 to 80 years old in this country.
Let me ask you, do you feel that the primaries still serve the purpose for which they were originally intended? Don?
They serve a purpose. They serve a purpose for mainly to help underdog candidates gain some exposure. From the point of view of it, if somebody who have an inside track, it helps them sort of keep their flock together and fend off the attacks from the underdogs. But is that serving the purpose that it was intended to serve? No. It really hasn't, I don't think, has democratized things. It's low turnout elections, usually low turnout elections. They are sometimes not always connected to the convention delegates, and that the heavy media coverage of them turn them into national type beauty contests. In terms of citizens getting involved in the affairs of their parties, I don't think the citizens have done it, and I don't think parties have particularly benefited from it.
Well, what's the alternative? Let me ask you that. Jim, you've been very directly involved in local and to a certain extent even county and state politics. What's the alternative? On the assumption that Don may be right, that they're really not serving the proper purpose. What would you suggest we might consider?
Paul, I don't know if I have a good answer for you on that one. I think Don is correct that we have some real problems. I'm very concerned about the fact that we haven't found an appropriate way to deal with the media, and we've front-loaded these primaries in such a way that we almost, this go-around, got in the business of making someone the nominee of the party who did not have a record. And it, in some ways, can work against, I think, the individual who has a record. And I'm very concerned about that. I think, as you know, the primary is really party business, and how the party chooses to deal with its apparatus it's up to the party. And I do think that they should take a good hard look at just what we are doing with ourselves and how we are working vis-a-vis the media. I don't have an answer for you, though. I don't know what it would be, but I know that it needs to be looked at.
Yes, John.
I just wanted to ask Jim if he thinks that the idea that the primary, with all of its defects, somehow as a kind of endurance test, actually benefits the candidate in the long run by pulling his supporters together, sharpening his wits, so to speak, and so that by the time the candidate gets to the convention, the candidate is ready to do battle with the opposition party. Do you see the primary as a kind of endurance test being beneficial?
Well, I think you've kind of given some of the answer to that question in your question. Yeah, sure. I think it is. Some of the testing that Walter Mondale has had to undergo in this primary is certainly beneficial. The days of shame charge, this won't be the first time, but he will hear that. Unfortunately, I think it may wind up being Gary Hart blurb across the Republican advertisement where you'll hear it from, and that'll be as harmful as voodoo economics was to Ronald Reagan. But I would concur that I do think that the process does sort of steel the candidate for the greater battle down the line.
It provides a lot of also ammunition for the other side. I mean, it's
we win some, you lose some.
Yeah, and the Democratic Party has had some great difficulty with primaries recently in terms of getting those primaries to resolve intra-party conflicts, but they've sort of spilled those conflicts out. That's happened to Republicans too, but it seems so noticeable, I guess this time around, that Democrats are really waging war against fellow Democrats.
Let me hitchhike on that thought too. I thought I was having a conversation with one of our colleagues from the British Isles, and he was making the point. He was also talking about the grueling pace and the longevity of our primary. And then he threw in another note. He said, I come from a country that really is quite small, and I think, gee, it's nice to do it and get it over with, and it doesn't bore everybody to tears. You go on for a year or so. And then he threw in the other thought. He said, but as I go across this country, I'm just amazed at how big it is and how diverse it is. And maybe we really do need something that long to begin to incorporate our diversity, because it still is a great, diverse country.
But would you then argue in favor of regional primaries, as opposed to separate state primaries, let's say, where you have one in Connecticut and one in Georgia and one in Oregon on the same day, which is a logistical nightmare for a candidate? Perhaps regional primaries, where the industrial Northeast all votes at one time, and Dixie all votes at one time, and the far West all votes at one time. Could you see any sense to that kind of approach?
Well, I could, for the reason that you just gave, in the sense that it uncomplicates a great deal. But on the other hand, I can see the impact of a whole region voting on one. I mean, that's Super Wednesday or Super Tuesday, Super Tuesday, and the impact that can have. I think it's a very complex and complicated issue, and I'm not sure there are any nice cookie-cutter answers for it. I wish there were.
I've heard of the idea of the regional primary, and it sounds interesting. One of the things that would happen, however, is it would reinforce regionalism in American politics. Because now it makes regions the center of action. Now with the way that states are, that each state comes out as an actor and has its own primary. Now we take Dixie and say, Dixie, you're a unit of analysis politically, and we have to contend with Dixie.
How do you feel about a national primary, which takes place, let's say, on one day for the whole United States? It's a one-shot deal.
I find that a little more interesting, because it would force that candidates to appeal to all of the diversity and not to have your Dixie message and then go up to the Northeast with another message. It would force them to appeal to a large national audience, similar to the kind of national audience they're going to have to appeal to for the general election.
Let me ask you a question about messages. We have been unable to pick up a paper or turn on the television or the radio since the beginning of this calendar year without something that pertains to the primaries. The media has, shall we say, thoroughly covered the primary issue. Is that good? Is that bad? How do you feel about the fact that there is so much information available about the candidates and about the states that are going to have their primaries, and then, as an example, you discover that a lot of the interviews on television are orchestrated. You discover that someone makes a blunder with something they have said, and that the media will, to a certain extent, play on that. And when it's all over with, as it was just a few days ago, our primary, you discover that only 25% of the people showed up at the polls. Are they giving us a message? What would be your reaction to that?
One way to react to it is that, why is the media covering it? It's interesting to somebody. They wouldn't do it. Their researchers would say, don't bother with that. But the way the media covers it, I think that's what people might be turned off about. The media is the basis of research that we know about is the media is covering the horse race. It's covering what Mondale said about Hart, what Hart said about Mondale, what Jackson said about, and it's who's appearing to be ahead, who's behind, and what does that have to do with the governing of a nation? And the reason the turnout might be low is because people are sick and tired of the horse race, and they want to know how their lives are going to be affected. What's the future for themselves, for their grandchildren, and that the media is not giving them that. The media is telling them who's ahead, who's behind.
So you're saying we could focus more on the issues?
I don't know. That we could put that focus on the issues, but traditionally issues have been covered in a way which doesn't attract a lot of people. It's going to have to be some kind of different coverage, in-depth coverage of issues, which media hasn't done up to this point.
Paul, one of the criticisms that's always made of the whole electoral process in America is that it drags on for so long, and by the time the actual choice comes to vote for your representatives or your executive leaders, the American people are already so bored with the whole process that they don't bother to go vote. Or they've been told by the pundits and the pollsters that it's not really a horse race anymore, that it's really decided, and so they don't bother to go vote. But I'm not sure that's the fault of the media. I mean, the reforms of the electoral process should take place without reference to the fact that the media is covering this for a long period of time.
What do we do? What kind of a message do you get, if I may carry this now, into the turnout? In Maryland, we had, correct me if I'm wrong, about approximately 25% turnout. I realize in a democracy that's your choice if you don't want to go to the polls. But is there a message there to build upon what John has said? Are people saying we're not getting the issues and therefore we are turned off?
One of the things is that 25% is the 25% of the registered voters. And so when you start saying that it's of the people that registered, 25% of them turned out, 25% of the registered Democrats turned out in the Democratic primary, you're really dealing with some very, very, very small numbers, even smaller than 25%. Politics is, the impression I'm getting is people think, well, it's all over, it's all settled. We're going to re-elect the president, and that the Democrats, that Walter Mondale's a sacrificial lamb. This is the pundits speaking, and so people are sort of falling into line, saying, well, why get really excited about it?
Let me interject, Paul. I think before we dwell too much on the 25% turnout yesterday, one must take into consideration that it was a lousy day. I stood out at those polls most of the morning myself, and it couldn't make up its mind whether it just wanted to suck you up into a cloud or you were going to just be slowly drizzled away. There were very few people coming out. They were steady, but at very small numbers. And just when it brightened up and we thought, well, of course your high voting time is early in the morning or late in the afternoon. And it brightened up and we thought, well, maybe we'll get a break from this and people will come out and vote. And then we got hit at the best time when people are getting off from work. We got hit with a real storm. And so I think, at least, and I happened to have had to drive down from Baltimore to Washington late yesterday afternoon, and so that was the case, at least between those two destinations. And I think you really do have to lay the weather as part of the blame for the low turnout yesterday. I wouldn't want you to say it was all just because of the composition of the race. And one thing further that I think is important to add here, Jesse Jackson got 43% of the vote in Prince George's County. That is a turnaround. And I think when we start talking about, the blahs in elections, the fact that Jesse Jackson gets 43% of the vote in Prince George's County doesn't tell me that the blahs. There's still some dynamism in the system.
At one time or another, all of the candidates, including Mr. Jackson, have had something to say about or something to say with regard to the fact that the media is not quite carrying the message that I originally intended. They're manipulating everything from the photographs to the interview that I had. Do the candidates manipulate the system? Do the candidates manipulate the media? We've laid a bit of a burden on the media. Now let's turn it around and say, do the candidates orchestrate their appearances and their actions, things of this sort?
Yeah, they have to make the evening news. Things have to be done, so it's going to be covered. So make the evening news. The perfect thing for a candidate to do is to get invited to the National Press Club to speak, because if you get to speak at the National Press Club, you're going to have national coverage, and that with that national coverage, that coverage is just is going to hit those networks, and you for sure are going to get your message across. It's timed perfectly. And this is one example.
Well, on election eve, Walter Mondale touched down at the BWI airport, stayed just long enough to attract a few television cameras and wave his friendly hand and smile his friendly smile, and he got right back on his plane and left again. The only purpose of that was to get on the 11 o'clock evening news. So the last thing people would see before they went to bed at night was the cheery wave of Walter Mondale. So yes, the candidates try to manipulate the media, and I think to some extent the media do try to manipulate the candidates. I think the media tries to provoke news, to in a sense, create news sometimes, and so they're really sort of using each other.
Does it get to be difficult then for a voter who really wants to listen to the issues? Does it get to be difficult for them to make an intelligent choice, knowing that some things are being orchestrated Can they still do that? Can they still say, I've been able to wade through all of this, and I really believe that candidate X is the one that I really support? How do they wade through that? How do they sort that out?
I think they can. A good example, I think, of using the media was Mondale's catchphrase, "Where's the beef?" What he did with that was say, he needed something that was short and pithy and to the point that said, I want to know what these new ideas are. And he said, "What's the beef?" And it caught on, and that was a manipulation of the media. And it did it. It worked for him, and it began to turn some things around.
Let's bring it down to local politics. Do you think that there might possibly be so much concentration on national issues that in Maryland, when we're looking at candidates who are running for different local offices, that sometimes we lose that perspective? I go to the polls and I recognize the national candidates, but some of the people who are running for positions such as a judge or a member of the county council, a local member of the House of Delegates, I'm not quite familiar with those names. Have I missed something along the way? Is the media giving me the right amount of coverage?
Well, we have been absorbed since the first of the year with national politics. We've had that every day on our agenda, and that the local politics, which is also really quite important, doesn't get that coverage because it's not as newsworthy. It gets relegated to the time after the evening news, or squeezed in between two evening news broadcasts on some occasions, and so it gets played down. And there's so many localities that the media is going to focus on the national issues. It's a nationalizing force in American life, and it sort of leaves state and local politics and political issues back in the dust.
We also need to appreciate the fact that there were very few other races being run yesterday. I thought the media did a fairly good job of covering the one significant congressional race, which was in the Republican sector. So, the judges do get lost. In a way, it's kind of funny. It's, that we're in the advanced part of the 20th century with a good hunk of the campaign, and yet on the other end of the spectrum, with the judges that you use, there was nothing better and more useful than to be able to hand out a card yesterday that had the names of the judges on it. So, we went from the very old, tried and true and tested to the very new methods.
I think what you're saying, Jim, is it's not the media's fault if the elections are dull, right?
Right.
I mean, where are the parties bringing forth the candidates and the issues that would make our elections stimulating and by doing so get the citizenry involved in the political system? So you can't totally blame the media, although I do think that some blame ought to rest there. They do, I think, tend to emphasize the superficial. They tend to emphasize the trivial sometimes when they don't have anything else to do. But I think in general it's not fair to blame the media for the dullness of the elections that we saw, not just this time, but in the last few years.
We made the elections process, or the selection process of presidents, into not only agonizing, but through the primary system, that we've taken the control away from political party leaders, and we've ripped resources away from political party leadership that used to be there, so that if political party leaders cannot pass out jobs, and they can't really take much of a position in terms of issues, then that you've got a tremendous power vacuum that exists in American politics, and media, and this media candidate symbiotic relationship, or the feeding off of each other, has come to replace responsible political parties. It's hard for American political parties to be responsible now because of these reasons.
Let me ask you to comment on an article that I read in Sun Papers, I believe, in which the writer reviewed the primaries in Maryland in the 20th century and said essentially that although he felt they were fairly important, that really Maryland had had no impact on the outcome or the philosophy of any of the national elections. And I got the impression that with the exception of a few incidents here and there that crop up, such as John Kennedy and the election in the primary in West Virginia in 1960, and perhaps a few others, that the primaries don't carry that much influence. Do you think that's a fair assessment of primaries?
The early primaries have an effect, and probably some of the big state primaries certainly have an effect. How does a smaller state like a West Virginia or a Maryland get effective? Well, lightning strikes sometimes, and it did in the case of John Kennedy in West Virginia. It was the perfect place for him to address some issues and to win a primary there. Now, what about Maryland? Well, the lightning hasn't struck very heavily here recently, but if you were to think back at the 1972 election, the elimination of George Wallace from the contest in Maryland, not through voting, but that primary brought him to Maryland and brought that and had a major effect.
And you also have the primary that thrust Jerry Brown to the front. I wouldn't say that Maryland has been insignificant in that process. After all, we've been known as the maverick state in the primary process, and it has allowed certain candidates to bubble to the top, which they would not have done otherwise. So I wouldn't say that I think the article was wrong. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that we have the magnetism of Ohio or New York or Florida or Texas or California.
Because of the number of the votes that are at stake.
We're just not big enough.
Well, I gather that we think that the primaries are going to continue. Any last thoughts on what we might possibly do with the given situation politically that will stay around? Any suggestions on what we might do to try to improve the image of the primary or its importance?
Consolidating some of the primaries into either regional or national primary would help. Having more connection between those primary votes and delegates. That's what I would say.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you for your participation. It's been very enlightening. We've run the gamut of local to national political issues, and it is obvious that primaries are important in our political process, and that they are here to stay. And there is, as you know, in both major political parties, efforts to try to improve the process as well as at the local level with primaries. I thank you for your participation, and join us next week for Agenda 84.